Putting London and Barnet on the map, the first 1500 years. Welcome to this lecture in memory of the late Dr. Gillian Gear, local historian and inspiration behind Barnet Museum. In October 2019, Peter Barber delivered the fourth Gillian Gear Lecture. For many years, Peter was head of the maps collection at the British Library, which he joined in 1975, just 2 years after it was created. Sadly, we weren't able to record his talk, but Peter has made available his slide display and script, and very kindly allowed Barnet Museum to recreate his lecture in this recording. It tells the remarkable story of how London and then Barnet were put on the map during a period of some 1500 years. And what better way to hear the story than in the words of one of our leading authorities on maps. So, with profound thanks to Peter, with whom I have the privilege of studying history many decades ago, I now have the unusual privilege of narrating his lecture, illustrated by slides chosen by him and in his own words. And all this in memory of Gillian Gear, who herself did so much to put Barnet Museum on the map. Contrary to popular assumptions, maps are subjective because they represent a selection from reality. The criteria for selection reflect the values of the map maker and his time. So they are valuable not so much for the information they convey, though this can be important, as for the insight they give into past attitudes and mentalities. This presentation is intended to show the differing images of London over the centuries and how an awareness of Barnet by outsiders emerged side by side with its physical development. It's particularly interesting to see for how long Barnet was viewed and mapped by outsiders, but also from the year 1600 by insiders as totally distinct from London. In this, it was unlike villages closer to London, like Highgate or Hampstead, let alone Islington or Chelsea, which were considered psychologically, if not physically, as part of what today is Greater London from at least the late 17th century. The presentation ends in the early 19th century, when for the first time, that began to change. In terms of its mapping, London can only be understood in a European context, since its image was successively influenced by Italian, German, and French, as well as indigenous English models. Surveying has always been expensive. As a result, commercial map makers, despite marketing boasts to the contrary, copied the work of their predecessors, amending and updating as necessary. Thus, over 1500 years, the cartographic image of London tended to remain the same for long periods, initially for centuries, and only later for decades. The first maps of London were probably created in Roman times. Though examples are now lost, its location was certainly marked on Roman itineraries. And like other major settlements or coloni, Londinium would also have been mapped in detail. As we can see in the detail on this gold medallion depicting the liberation of London in the year 296. The knowledge of Roman mapping, updated in places to reflect changing times, survived into early modern times, as witnessed by the Anglo-Saxon world map of about 1025. Here we see London clearly marked. Like most medieval European cities, London was depicted as a walled city. With views of representative examples of the most important buildings within its walls, notably Old St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower, and London Bridge. The first maps of Great Britain by Matthew Paris, a monk of St. Albans, created in about 1250, show London, but do not indicate Barnet. But this changes during the Middle Ages, reflecting the grant of a charter for Barnet's market and the growing importance of its inns. With the first detailed map of Great Britain, the so-called Goth map of about 1400, shown here on its side pointing east. It names Barnet in the centre of this detail. Evolving Goth-like maps continue to be drawn well into the 16th century. From about 1480, however, the mapping of London had been influenced by the earliest printed map of Florence, dating from around 1470. Like Florence, London was mapped as if viewed obliquely from a fictitious hill, in this case to the east of the Tower of London. Though the original map is lost, there were many reduced derivatives, most of them no smaller than little vignettes on maps of much larger areas. As in the proposal depicted here, to bring Anne of Cleves to London in 1539 to marry Henry VIII. A vignette of 1539 already shows London expanding well beyond its medieval walls. We see more vignettes of the walled city. With birds circling the spire of Old St. Paul's. The next wave of map views was influenced by the town views to be found from the early 15th century in Flemish art. It is best represented in the drawings of Anton van den Wingard of about 1540. These viewed London not upriver from the east, but from the south bank, looking north and dominated by St. Paul's. They were probably commissioned by Henry VIII for his audience chamber in Whitehall Palace, where they would have faced Holbein's imposing family portrait of the Tudor dynasty. The image would have been seen by many and was much copied, often in reduced form. Until the middle of the 17th century. From the early 15th century, German humanists became interested in the scientific measurement of space. They found advocates in England, like Dürer's friend, the royal astronomer under Henry VIII, Nicholas Kratzer. In mid-1550s, The German merchants of the Hanseatic League in London, like Derek Bourne, tried to recruit Queen Mary's husband, Philip II, seen on the left. He was known to be fascinated by maps, for their struggle to maintain their rights in face of fierce opposition from English merchants led by Sir Thomas Gresham. These German merchants financed the creation of the first detailed printed scale map of London, modelled on a bird's eye plan of Augsburg of 1521. Viewed as from the top of a lofty tower. Here is a similar bird's eye view of Norwich. Their map of London, the so-called copperplate map, is known now only through the survival of 3 of its original 15 copperplates. It portrayed London as a royal as well as a merchant city. Here we see the royal barge and Mercer's Hall. And the walled community on the Thames where the German merchants settled, called the Steelyard. Copied in miniaturized form and as a woodcut, the so-called Agassiz map, it became the standard image of London for the next century. Sending the message that London was dependent on the German merchants of the Steelyard and had an ancient and glorious history going back to Brute the Trojan. German and particularly Nuremberg mapmakers influenced the first English mapmakers to create regional maps drawn to scale, showing major roads and with signs indicating historical and cultural information. Notable was John Norden, whose map of Middlesex in 1593 locates not only Barnet, but also the site of the famous Battle of 1471. English lawyers were among the first makers of maps of small areas, usually as a means of clarifying legal problems and depicting property. By the end of the 17th century, such plans played a key part in urban development, and particularly the development of the great aristocratic estates. Barnet was named on Christopher Saxton's map of southeast England of 1575. But John Speed's map of Hertfordshire in 1611 to 1612 was the first to show it on its hill, as well as East Barnet and Hadley. However, the detailed layout of Chipping Barnet was first portrayed on a manuscript map of the routes from London prepared for James I's minister Robert Cecil in about 1608. It shows a layout that remained essentially unchanged to the present day, as we can see in the distinctive intersection of roads at the parish church of St John the Baptist, Chipping Barnet. And here we see the intersection at ground level. That road layout was first shown on a printed map in John Ogilby's road map Britannia in 1675. By the 1650s, London needed a new map to take account of the development that had taken place since the 1550s indicated on the lower map. After false starts by Thomas Porter in 1654, who for the first time showed the East End of London, and false starts by Newcourt and Faithorne in 1658, who presented a cavalier's view of London despite the Commonwealth, there were two major responses from the mapmakers. From 1660, Wenceslas Holler tried to create an immensely detailed and German-influenced bird's-eye map. Here we see the Germanic influence. And here the pictorial London equivalent. However, such pictorial mapping was looked down on in the intellectual circles to which Charles II belonged, and so after the Great Fire of 1666, the remapping of London was entrusted to a consortium of surveyors and mathematicians under the auspices of the newly founded Royal Society. They were much influenced by the mapping being undertaken at the time for the French government. The consortium created the first geometrically accurate ground plan of roads and buildings throughout the city, Westminster, and Southwark. The data was brought together into large maps. The austerity of the first, published in 1676 and centred on the city, omitted any reference to royalty or Anglicanism, reflecting the dominance and values of the political factions that then dominated Parliament and had paid for its publication. Note the austerity of Holborn, depicted in the lower image, compared with Holler's version 10 years earlier, depicted above it. The flamboyant decoration and royal symbolism of the second map, published in 1682, reflects those of Charles II following his suspension of the city's liberties in the previous year. The elevations of important buildings could be seen amidst the ground plans of the 1682 map. And there continued to be a place for the pictorial in London maps over the next century. From the end of the 17th century and reflecting London's increasing economic dominance, for the first time maps were published showing London at the centre of its economic region and no longer simply as the county town of Middlesex. Here the Barnet area is shown, but at a distance from the economic hub. A particularly notable example was John Warburton's map of Middlesex and Hertfordshire of 1725, updated and re-engraved in 1747. It drew attention to the homes of city merchants who sponsored the map and had weekend homes in the surrounding villages. The numbers indicating their homes were linked to the display of their arms in the map's margins. Few such homes are shown in Barnet, reflecting the fact that it was still too distant from the capital for most wealthy London citizens in search of a convenient second home. "1746 saw the publication of John Roke's new, detailed and French-style map of London, Westminster and Southwark. In the same year, he published a detailed multi-sheet map of London and its environs, but this still did not extend to Barnet. Barnet was, however, shown in some detail in Roke's topographical map of the county of Middlesex, published in 1754. All Roke's maps were sponsored by the nobility and the establishment, and so unsurprisingly the maps emphasised their homes and the institutions associated with them. However, the next great map of London, surveyed by Richard Horwood and first published in 1799, was financed by the Phoenix Insurance Company. In contrast to Roke's maps, it reflects the values of business and industry. Horwood attempted to identify every house, however humble, together with breweries and warehouses and factories. It was the last map to try to accommodate detailed information about London on a single, albeit enormous, wall map. The first English estate maps drawn to a uniform scale were created in the 1570s, and within 30 years, estates in the neighbourhood of Barnet were being mapped. In some cases, the original surveyor's notebook, draft map, and finished presentation map have survived. By the mid-18th century, for the first time, maps of Barnet were being commissioned not by London map publishers, but by locals, the lords of the manor and the town's wealthier residents, for their own purposes. Such mapping in manuscript was generally of a high standard and included a few vanity projects. Maps of suburban villas and their gardens, for instance, quite unnecessarily mapped for their socially ambitious owners. As though there were great landed estates. By 1800, government was for the first time taking an active interest in the official mapping of the United Kingdom, and the newly created Ordnance Survey was its agent. The original manuscript drafts for the Barnet area of 1805 and at a scale of 2 inches to the mile survive, and the printed maps derived from them, published in 1822 at a scale of 1 inch to the mile, are well known. Charles Smith's new map of the country 12 miles around London of 1822 show the effects of the road improvements since the 1720s, when Warburton published his map. Thanks to turnpike roads and the extension of a basic public transport system, Barnet is shown as full of the second homes of wealthy Londoners. Psychologically, it was already a part of what is now Greater London, though the flood of building that was to make it physically part of the metropolis was only to follow a century later. So it is with Charles Smith's new map of 1822 that the story of how London and Barnet were mapped over the first 1500 years draws to a close. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation as much as I have enjoyed narrating it. Our sincere thanks again to Peter Barber, to the memory of Gillian Gear, and to the many friends and supporters of Barnet Museum.